cockpit had gone unnaturally silent. Not because the alarms had stopped, but because the two massive jet engines no longer made a sound. At 31,000 feet, Flight 782 had become nothing more than a 70-ton glider drifting above endless mountains. Red warning lights flashed across every instrument panel. Passengers screamed. A child cried somewhere behind the cockpit door. The captain tightened his grip on the controls as the aircraft continued losing altitude. Engine 1, dead. The first officer looked up from the emergency checklist, his face drained of color. Engine 2, gone too. The words felt impossible to say. Two engines failing together wasn't supposed to happen. Not on a modern airliner, not on a clear afternoon with perfect weather. Outside the windshield, rugged mountain peaks stretched toward the horizon. There wasn't a single airport within reach. Air traffic control kept speaking over the radio, offering options that no longer mattered. Every calculation ended the same way. They would never make the runway. The silence inside the cockpit became heavier than the alarms themselves. Then the first officer remembered something. A woman. Row 8. She had boarded quietly. No expensive luggage, no business suit. No attempt to draw attention. But he'd noticed strange details. The way she instinctively studied every emergency exit before sitting down. The weather charts folded inside her notebook. The faded military patch stitched inside her old leather jacket. Without waiting for permission, he unstrapped his harness and sprinted into the cabin. The frightened passengers stared as he stopped beside the quiet woman. His voice shook. "I don't know who you are, but I think we need you." She slowly closed her notebook. Unlike everyone else on board, her hands weren't trembling. She simply stood, calm, focused, as though she had walked into moments like this before. Seconds later, she stepped inside the cockpit. The captain turned in disbelief. "What is this? We don't have time for passengers." Before anyone could answer, two Air Force fighter jets roared into formation beside the powerless aircraft. One of the fighter pilots broke radio silence. His voice was sharp, urgent. "Unidentified advisor inside Flight 782. State your military call sign immediately." For the first time, the quiet woman spoke into the microphone. One single word. The fighter pilot froze. Then another voice burst across the military frequency. It can't be." Every pilot listening suddenly knew exactly who she was. "Before we begin, comment where you're watching from." Only 45 minutes earlier, nothing about Flight 782 suggested it would become the story the entire world would soon be talking about. Captain Daniel Mercer arrived at the terminal before sunrise, carrying the same worn flight bag he had used for nearly 3 decades. At 58 years old, he had logged over 19,000 flight hours and had earned a reputation as one of North Star Airlines' calmest captains. Younger pilots often joked that if Daniel was flying, even thunderstorms seemed to move out of the way. His first officer, Ryan Cole, was already inside the cockpit reviewing the flight plan. "Morning, Captain." "Everything looking good?" Ryan smiled. "Clear skies from departure to destination. Smooth winds. Maintenance signed off the aircraft overnight. She's ready to fly." Daniel glanced through the paperwork one final time. Fuel quantities matched perfectly. Hydraulic systems showed normal pressure. Electrical buses were healthy. Navigation systems were fully operational. It looked like another routine afternoon crossing. Outside, passengers slowly filled the boarding bridge, families returning from vacation, students heading back to college, business travelers glued to their phones, an elderly couple arguing playfully over which seat had the better window view. Among them walked a woman who attracted absolutely no attention. Her name was Claire Bennett. She carried a weathered canvas backpack instead of expensive luggage and wore faded jeans, hiking boots, and a gray jacket that looked older than some of the passengers on board. Her dark hair was tied into a simple ponytail beneath a baseball cap. She never looked at her phone. Instead, her eyes quietly studied everything around her. She noticed the emergency vehicles parked near the runway. She counted the cabin exits before reaching her row. She instinctively measured the distance between seats as she walked. Old habits. Habits that refused to disappear. Claire settled into seat 8A beside the window without saying much. After placing her backpack beneath the seat, she removed a small notebook filled with handwritten calculations and a thick aviation reference guide covered in plain brown paper. To everyone else, it looked like an ordinary notebook. Ryan happened to pass row 8 during his final cabin inspection. As he glanced down, one page caught his eye. It wasn't ordinary notes. It contained detailed diagrams of emergency glide paths, airflow patterns over mountain terrain, and handwritten formulas calculating lift without engine power. Ryan paused for only a second. Interesting. Maybe she taught aviation. Maybe she was simply an enthusiast. He smiled politely before continuing toward the cockpit, never imagining that within the next hour, the quiet woman in row 8 would become the only reason every soul aboard Flight 782 had a chance of seeing home again. As Flight 782 settled into its cruising altitude above the western mountain ranges, the tension of boarding disappeared. The seatbelt sign chimed off. Conversations filled the cabin, and the atmosphere became comfortably ordinary. Flight attendants rolled beverage carts through the aisle while soft music played from passengers' headphones. Laptops opened. Movies started. Children pressed their faces against the windows, pointing excitedly at the snow-covered peaks drifting below. To everyone on board, it was simply another flight. To Claire Bennett, it never was. She accepted a bottle of water with a polite smile before returning her attention to the notebook resting on her tray table. Inside were pages that looked more like engineering blueprints than personal notes, hand-drawn aircraft silhouettes, emergency descent profiles, wind calculations, landing sketches. Every page reflected years of disciplined thinking. The businessman beside her glanced over. "You studying for a pilot's exam?" he asked with a friendly grin. Claire closed the notebook halfway. "Something like that." He chuckled. "Bit late for homework, isn't it?" She smiled politely, but didn't answer. Some memories weren't meant for strangers. Looking through the window, she watched the sunlight shimmer across distant ridgelines. The mountains looked peaceful, but her eyes searched for details most travelers would never notice. A thin gray veil stretched across part of the horizon, almost invisible. Almost. She leaned closer to the glass. It wasn't cloud, it wasn't fog. The color was wrong. The movement was wrong. Years of experience whispered a warning, long before her mind fully understood it. She reached into her backpack and removed a small weather notebook filled with handwritten observations collected over countless flights. Comparing today's wind direction with recent weather reports, she quietly made several calculations. Something wasn't adding up. A memory surfaced. Many years earlier, during one of the most dangerous missions of her career, she had flown through a nearly invisible cloud that had scarred her aircraft's engines within seconds. The sky had looked almost identical. Her heartbeat slowed instead of racing. That was how years of training changed a person. Panic wasted energy. Observation saved lives. Claire opened the aircraft's flight map on the entertainment screen. The projected route crossed directly toward the hazy layer. She checked the outside air temperature, the altitude, the wind direction. Everything pointed toward the same conclusion. If that haze was what she feared, every minute carried them closer to disaster. She looked toward the locked cockpit door. Should she say something? How could she? To everyone else, she was simply another passenger in row 8. No uniform, no credentials. No reason anyone should believe her. She slowly exhaled, closed her eyes for a moment, and hoped, more than anything, that her instincts were wrong. Unfortunately, they almost never were. For nearly 10 more minutes, Flight 782 continued north through calm skies, as if nothing in the world could possibly go wrong. Captain Daniel Mercer leaned back slightly in his seat, taking a sip of coffee, while First Officer Ryan Cole reviewed weather updates ahead. "Still smooth all the way," Ryan said. "No storms, no turbulence, no traffic conflicts." Daniel smiled. "Looks like we'll be early." Then a soft chime interrupted the quiet. Ryan frowned at one of the engine displays. "Captain, Engine 1's exhaust temperature just jumped." Daniel leaned forward. "How much? Only a few degrees?" "Probably a faulty sensor." It wasn't unusual. Modern airliners occasionally produced false warnings, and experienced pilots learned not to chase every blinking light. Ryan continued watching the display. 5 seconds later, his expression changed. It just climbed again. This time, the increase wasn't small. It was accelerating. Daniel immediately canceled the autopilot and wrapped both hands around the controls. "Cross-check all engine instruments." Ryan's fingers flew across the overhead panel. Oil pressure normal. Fuel flow unstable. Vibration increasing. Before either pilot could finish analyzing the data, a violent shudder ripped through the aircraft. Passengers looked around in confusion. Coffee splashed across tray tables. The overhead bins rattled loudly. Then came a deep, metallic cough from beneath the left wing. A sound neither pilot ever wanted to hear. "Engine 1, flame out!" The warning alarm echoed through the cockpit. Daniel reacted instantly, beginning the emergency memory items exactly as he had practiced hundreds of times in simulators. "Engine secured." Ryan grabbed the emergency checklist. "Attempting restart." The aircraft continued flying. One engine was enough. It wasn't good, but it wasn't fatal. Daniel took a slow breath. "We'll divert to the nearest airport." Before Ryan could answer, another warning exploded across the cockpit. A piercing alarm, another violent vibration. His eyes widened. "No!" The right engine's temperature climbed off the scale. Power dropped almost instantly. The aircraft lurched again. Then, silence. An eerie, impossible silence replaced the familiar roar that had filled the cockpit since takeoff. Both engines had quit. Every warning light illuminated simultaneously. The aircraft was no longer flying under power. It was falling. Ryan's voice cracked as he stared at the instruments. "Captain," Daniel already knew, "we've lost both engines." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. He pressed the radio switch. "Mayday! Mayday! Mayday! Flight 782 declaring an emergency. Dual engine failure at 31,000 feet. We are now a powerless aircraft. Air traffic control answered immediately. But as Daniel calculated the remaining glide distance, the numbers became brutally clear. The nearest runway was simply too far away. No matter what he tried, Flight 782 wasn't going to make it. And behind the cockpit door in row 8, Claire Bennett quietly looked out the window, because she already knew exactly why the engines had died. The warning siren echoed through the cabin. A calm voice from the speakers tried to reassure everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are experiencing a technical issue. Please fasten your seatbelts immediately and remain seated. No one believed it was just a technical issue. The aircraft was descending, not smoothly anymore. Without engine thrust, every second felt different. The familiar vibration of the engines had disappeared, replaced by an unsettling rush of wind scraping against the fuselage. People looked at each other in confusion. Some reached for their phones, others clutched the hands of strangers. A little girl buried her face against her mother's shoulder. Near the front galley, one flight attendant fought to keep her composure while helping frightened passengers tighten their seatbelts. Inside the cockpit, Captain Daniel Mercer stared at the navigation display in disbelief. Current glide range? Ryan entered the latest figures into the flight computer. Several agonizing seconds passed before the answer appeared. His face turned pale. We're 14 miles short. Daniel recalculated manually. Same result. Even if every move was perfect, the airplane would never reach the airport. Beyond the windshield stretched nothing but steep forests, rocky ridges, and deep valleys. There wasn't a single safe place to land. Ryan swallowed hard. Then a memory flashed into his mind. The woman in row 8. The strange notebook. The emergency glide equations. The way she'd quietly studied mountain airflow before takeoff. Without another word, he released his harness. "Ryan," Daniel shouted, "what are you doing?" "I think I know someone who might help." "This isn't the time for guessing." Ryan ignored him. He rushed into the cabin, weaving through frightened passengers until he reached row 8. Claire Bennett wasn't praying. She wasn't crying. She wasn't even looking frightened. Instead, she calmly finished another page of calculations in her notebook, almost as if she'd been expecting this exact emergency. Ryan stopped beside her, breathing heavily. "I knew there was something different about you." Claire slowly looked up. Her eyes remained steady. "You noticed the notebook?" "I need the truth." She nodded once. "Well, you won't like the answer." "I don't care. Are you a pilot?" "I was." "Military?" She hesitated only briefly. "For 20 years." Ryan's heart pounded. "What did you fly?" Claire closed her notebook. "Aircraft that were never supposed to come home." Ryan stared at her. There was no arrogance in her voice, no attempt to impress him, only quiet certainty. He made the biggest decision of his career. "Come with me." Several passengers watched in confusion as the quiet woman from row 8 followed the first officer toward the cockpit. The businessman who had ignored her all flight finally spoke. "Who is she?" No one answered. Seconds later, Claire stepped inside the cockpit. Captain Mercer spun around, his frustration boiling over. "What is this? We are fighting for every second, and you bring me a passenger?" Ryan met his captain's eyes. "No, sir." He took a deep breath before saying the words that changed everything. "I think I just brought you our last chance." The cockpit fell silent the moment Claire Bennett stepped through the reinforced door. Warning alarms continued screaming. Altitude numbers continued falling. But for one brief moment, everyone simply looked at her. Captain Daniel Mercer couldn't hide his frustration. "This cockpit is restricted," he snapped. "We're dealing with a dual engine failure, not a passenger complaint." Claire remained calm. "I know." Ryan quickly stepped between them. "Captain, please, just hear her out." Daniel looked at the woman standing in front of him. She wore faded hiking boots, a weathered jacket, and carried nothing but a notebook. She looked more like someone heading to a camping trip than someone qualified to stand inside an airliner cockpit. "You have 30 seconds, Daniel said sharply. Claire walked closer to the instrument panel, scanning every display with remarkable speed. Altitude, airspeed, wind direction, glide path, navigation display. She absorbed everything in only a few seconds. Then she spoke. "You're aiming for Ridgeview International." Daniel nodded. "It's our closest runway." Claire quietly shook her head. "You'll never reach it." Daniel's jaw tightened. "We already know that." "No," she replied. "Oh, you know you'll come up short. What you don't know is where you'll actually survive." Ryan exchanged a glance with the captain. Claire pointed toward the navigation screen. 7 miles east of your current course is Falcon Ridge Airfield." Daniel frowned. "That's been abandoned for years." "It has. It's not maintained." "It doesn't need to be." Ryan quickly searched the database. His eyes widened. "The runway is still listed, 7,300 feet. Daniel stared at the display. "I've flown this route for 29 years. I don't remember ever seeing that field." "Because airline pilots never needed it," Claire answered. Military crews did. She opened her notebook and spread several handwritten sketches across the center console. I trained there. Daniel looked up. You trained there? She nodded. It was one of our emergency recovery strips. Then she pointed toward a jagged mountain range visible through the windshield. And those mountains aren't your enemy. Daniel looked confused. They're your engine now. Neither pilot spoke. Claire continued. Strong westerly winds are striking the ridge. That creates standing waves of rising air. If you enter them correctly, they'll slow your descent enough to reach Falcon Ridge. Ryan blinked. Like sailplanes? Exactly. Daniel frowned. A Boeing 737 isn't a glider. Claire met his eyes. No, but physics doesn't care what logo is painted on the tail. Before Daniel could respond, 2 gray fighter jets thundered past the cockpit windows, taking position off both wings. The radio suddenly crackled. Flight 782, this is Guardian Lead. We have visual contact. Claire froze. She recognized that voice. The fighter pilot spoke again. Unknown advisor inside Flight 782. Identify yourself. Claire slowly reached for the radio microphone. Her expression changed completely. Professional, disciplined, almost instinctive. This is Captain Claire Bennett, retired. A brief pause. Then she quietly added the one name she hadn't spoken in years. My call sign, Ghost Raven. The military frequency went completely silent. For 3 long seconds, no one said a word. The silence on the military frequency lasted only a heartbeat. Then every radio in the sky came alive. Did she just say Ghost Raven? No way. That's impossible. Guardian Lead pressed the transmit button again, but this time his voice carried disbelief instead of authority. Flight 782. Confirm your call sign. Claire didn't hesitate. Confirmed. Captain Claire Bennett, retired Air Force, former 52nd Tactical Squadron. Call sign, Ghost Raven. Another pause. Then the fighter pilot laughed softly, almost in relief. My God, I never thought I'd hear that voice again. Captain Mercer glanced toward her. You know him? Before Claire could answer, the fighter pilot spoke first. I know exactly who she is. His wingman joined the conversation. Captain, you're flying with the woman who brought 3 damaged fighters home during Operation Iron Shield. Half our squadron learned emergency flying from her. Inside the cockpit, Daniel slowly turned toward Claire. For the first time since the emergency began, he wasn't looking at an ordinary passenger. He was looking at someone whose reputation had reached people he'd never even met. Claire ignored the praise. Captain, focus. Daniel nodded immediately. Tell me what to do. She leaned forward, pointing through the windshield. Hold exactly 195 knots. Ryan adjusted the aircraft's pitch. Airspeed, 198, 196, holding 195. Good. Claire looked toward the approaching mountains. Now turn 8 degrees left. Daniel rolled the powerless aircraft gently. Outside, the jagged peaks filled the windshield. Every instinct in Daniel's body screamed that flying closer to the mountains was madness. Claire noticed the hesitation. Trust the air, not your fear. The aircraft crossed the first ridgeline. For several seconds, nothing changed. The vertical speed indicator continued falling. 2,000 feet per minute, 1,800, 1,700. Ryan's voice tightened. It's not working. Wait, Claire answered calmly. 3, 2, 1. Suddenly the aircraft gave a gentle upward surge. The nose lifted without anyone touching the controls. Ryan stared at the instruments. Captain, Daniel's eyes widened. Our descent rate, the numbers kept dropping. 1,600. 1,300, 900, 700, 500 feet per minute. We're riding the mountain wave, Claire said quietly. For the first time since both engines had failed, the aircraft wasn't falling toward the earth. It was almost floating. Guardian Lead watched in amazement from his fighter jet. I've never seen a commercial airliner fly like this. Claire smiled faintly. It isn't flying like an airliner anymore. She looked straight ahead toward the abandoned runway, still hidden beyond the mountains. It's flying like a survivor. Ryan checked the navigation display once more. His breathing stopped. We've just gained 12 miles of glide range. Captain Mercer whispered the words he never thought he'd say. We're actually going to reach the runway. Claire's expression remained focused. No, she shook her head. Reaching it is the easy part. She looked toward the cracked strip of concrete slowly appearing between the trees. The real fight starts when we try to land. The abandoned runway finally emerged from the forest. It looked more like a forgotten relic than a place where a commercial airliner could land. Cracked asphalt stretched between rows of towering pine trees. Weeds pushed through broken pavement, faded centerline markings barely visible beneath decades of neglect. There were no runway lights, no control tower, no emergency vehicles waiting below. Only one narrow strip of concrete, one chance. Captain Daniel Mercer tightened his grip on the controls. I've never landed anywhere like this. Claire Bennett never took her eyes off the windshield. Neither is anyone carrying 200 lives without engines. Her voice remained calm. Listen carefully. Every movement from this point forward matters. Ryan called out the numbers. Altitude, 3,000 feet. Airspeed, 195 knots. Claire nodded. Landing gear. Now. Daniel lowered the lever. A loud mechanical thud echoed beneath the aircraft as the wheels locked into place. Instantly, the drag increased. The airplane began sinking faster. Ryan watched the instruments. Descent increasing. That's expected, Claire replied. Hold your attitude. Don't chase the numbers. The runway continued, growing larger. Every second erased another chance to recover from a mistake. 2,000 feet. Flaps 5. Ryan moved the lever. The aircraft shuddered but remained stable. Outside, the trees seemed dangerously close. Guardian Lead circled high above, unable to help now. Everything depended on the 3 people inside the cockpit. 1,000 feet. Claire leaned forward. Don't look at the runway. Daniel frowned. What? Look beyond it. Your hands follow your eyes. If you stare at the pavement, you'll force the airplane down. Daniel shifted his focus toward the far end of the strip. Immediately, his control inputs became smoother. 500 feet. The abandoned runway filled the windshield. Every crack in the pavement was now visible. Ryan swallowed hard. Airspeed, 150. Claire's breathing remained perfectly steady. You're doing fine. 300 feet. Hold it. 200. Easy? 100. Silence. Even the warning alarm seemed distant now. Only the rushing wind remained. 50 feet. Claire spoke almost in a whisper. Now. Daniel gently raised the nose. The powerless jet floated for one endless second. Then, thump. The main landing gear slammed onto the concrete with bone-rattling force. The entire cabin erupted in terrified screams. Spoilers! Ryan pulled the lever. The wing panels snapped upward. Maximum brakes! Daniel pressed both pedals with every ounce of strength he had. Smoke exploded from the tires. The aircraft thundered down the abandoned runway, shaking violently over cracked pavement. 1,000 feet remaining, Ryan shouted. Still too fast. Trees rushed closer through the windshield. 800! The brakes screamed. 600! The airplane kept rolling. Guardian Lead watched helplessly from above. 400! Passengers clung to their seats, praying. 200! Daniel closed his eyes for the briefest instant. Then, the aircraft lurched one final time and stopped. Complete silence. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then applause broke out. It spread row by row, growing louder until the entire cabin was filled with tears, laughter, and overwhelming relief. Captain Mercer looked toward Claire, his voice barely above a whisper. You didn't just save this airplane. You gave every person on board another lifetime. For several long seconds, nobody inside Flight 782 moved. The cabin was wrapped in an almost surreal silence. People stared at one another as if they couldn't quite believe they were still alive. Then reality crashed over them. Someone began crying. Another passenger started laughing uncontrollably. A little boy unfastened his seatbelt and threw his arms around his mother. One by one, applause echoed through this cabin until every survivor was clapping, cheering, and thanking God. Inside the cockpit, Captain Daniel Mercer slowly released the controls. His hands were trembling so badly that he could barely unclench his fingers. Ryan leaned back in his seat, covering his face as tears streamed down his cheeks. We actually made it. Claire quietly removed her headset. Not yet. Both pilots looked at her. The aircraft is safe. She glanced toward the cabin. Now, let's get everyone home. Daniel immediately picked up the radio. Mayday aircraft flight 782, safely on the ground at Falcon Ridge Airfield. Repeat, we've landed safely. Approximately 200 souls on board. Request immediate rescue response. The controller paused before answering, almost unable to believe what he had heard. Flight 782. Confirm. Everyone survived? Daniel smiled for the first time since the engines had failed. Affirmative. A burst of cheers erupted over the emergency frequency. Within minutes, rescue helicopters, firefighters, medical teams, and law enforcement vehicles began racing toward the forgotten airfield. Outside, Guardian Lead circled once above the stranded aircraft before transmitting one final message. Ghost Raven, I've flown combat missions for 24 years. A short pause followed. I've never witnessed flying like that. Claire looked through the cockpit window at the cracked runway beneath them. It wasn't just flying. It was teamwork. As emergency crews helped passengers leave the aircraft, federal investigators arrived to examine the engines. What they discovered stunned everyone. The turbines weren't simply damaged, They had been fused together by a strange glass-like substance created when microscopic ash particles melted inside the engine core. But another discovery raised even darker questions. Laboratory tests found chemical compounds mixed with the ash. Compounds that did not occur naturally. Someone had altered it. Someone had intentionally kept the particles suspended in the atmosphere. This wasn't an accident. Within 48 hours, investigators traced the chemicals to a secret extremist network calling itself Earth's Reckoning. The group had used modified high-altitude drones to spread engineered volcanic ash across commercial flight corridors, believing fear would force governments to drastically reduce air travel. Instead, they had nearly caused one of the deadliest aviation disasters in modern history. As the arrests dominated headlines around the world, another question spread even faster. Who was the quiet woman from row 8? And why had a single radio call made veteran fighter pilots fall completely silent? 3 days later, every major news network in the country gathered inside a crowded conference hall. Camera flashes lit up the room. Microphones covered the front table. The headline on every screen was the same. Who is the woman who saved Flight 782? Captain Daniel Mercer and First Officer Ryan Cole took their seats first. Moments later, Claire Bennett quietly walked onto the stage wearing the same simple jacket she had worn on the flight. No medals, no decorations, no attempt to look like a hero, just the same quiet woman from row 8. The first reporter stood. Captain Bennett, military records show you disappeared from aviation several years ago. Why? Claire remained silent for a moment before answering. I didn't disappear. I was pushed out. The room became completely still. She took a slow breath. During my final overseas deployment, I was ordered to attack a compound that intelligence claimed was occupied by enemy fighters. She looked down briefly before continuing. But I saw children. I refused the order. Instead of firing, Claire coordinated with ground forces, giving them time to rescue the civilians and arrest the armed group without innocent lives being lost. The mission succeeded. The civilians survived, but her refusal to obey a direct command ended her military career. I lost my wings. I lost my squadron. I lost the only life I had ever known. For years, I worked ordinary jobs while people believed I had failed. A reporter quietly asked, if refusing that order cost you everything, would you still make the same decision today? Claire smiled gently, without hesitation. If protecting innocent people destroys my career, then my career was never more important than my conscience. The room erupted into applause. Captain Mercer leaned toward the microphone. I've flown airplanes for almost 30 years. I've trained for hundreds of emergencies. But the greatest lesson of my career came from someone sitting quietly in row 8. He looked toward Claire. Real leadership isn't about rank. It's about having the courage to step forward when everyone else is running out of answers. In the months that followed, the investigation cleared Claire's name completely. Military officials reopened her case, formally restoring her service record and recognizing her actions as an example of extraordinary courage rather than disobedience. Her emergency gliding techniques were added to advanced pilot training programs across the country, ensuring future crews would be better prepared for the unthinkable. Years later, survivors of Flight 782 gathered for a reunion at the very airfield where their lives had been saved. Children who had once cried in fear were now young adults, chasing careers in aviation. Parents introduced Claire to sons and daughters, who existed only because that airplane had landed safely. An elderly passenger held her hand with tears in his eyes. You didn't just save us that day. You gave us years we never would have had. Claire looked across the old runway as the evening sun disappeared behind the mountains. She smiled quietly, not because the world finally knew her name, but because every life on that aircraft had been given another chance. Sometimes, the strongest heroes aren't the loudest voices in the room. They're the ones no one notices, until the moment they're needed most. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who believes courage still exists in the world.